just gonna let my soul talk. I'm gonna speak my truth. I'm gonna let my soul talk. Take the path I know.
Yo, welcome, everybody. Welcome to the show where chains break, minds wake, and purpose takes its rightful place. You are at True Healing and Recovery with your boy, Coach Mikey Rowe. Ladies and gentlemen, today we walk into one of the most controversial conversations in all of recovery. That's right, in all of recovery. A conversation that divides treatment centers, divides churches, therapists, families, social media. I've seen it. I've seen some crazy division and anger and arguments on the social media regarding this topic, man. And even recovering addicts, recovering individuals themselves start to argue. The question is simple. But the answer changes everything. Is addiction a disease, or is it a choice? Now, listen carefully. Listen up. Because people lose relationships over this debate. People lose compassion over this debate. Some people lose their own recovery because of this conversation. Some people say, man, it's a brain disease. Others say, no, they choose it. And if we're honest, most people listening right now already picked a side emotionally before this episode even really begins. But today, I don't want to just argue a side. I'm not going to argue a side, folks. I want to expose something deeper. Because I believe the real issue is this. The real issue is addiction is not the primary problem. Addiction is the symptom. And the real battle is identity, trauma, belief systems, and emotional survival. And until we understand that, we will keep treating symptoms while people silently drown underneath them. So let's get started. Most people who have never struggled with addiction see addiction through behavior. What do they see? They see the lying, the stealing, the manipulation, the disappearing act, the relapse, the broken promises. And because behavior is what they see, they assume behavior is the problem. So they'll say to things like, man, why don't they just stop? And to someone who has never experienced addiction, that question does make sense. Because from the outside, it looks irrational. You're destroying your family. You're destroying your finances, your physical body. You're destroying your future. Yet you're continuing. So I understand. So naturally, people think, man, this just must be a selfish issue. But addiction is deeper than behavior. And pain that is ignored always searches for relief. I need everybody to hear this carefully. People are not always addicted to the substance. They are addicted to the escape. They are addicted to the relief, the numbness, the confidence that some get. I had some of that confidence, that social, that it was, to me, it was like a social lubricant. Made me confident around people. Some people are addicted to the silence and the emotional survival of what takes place. Listen, the substance is just the vehicle. That's why two people can drink alcohol and only one becomes consumed by it. Because addiction is rarely just about the substance. It's about what the substance does emotionally. Some people drink to celebrate. Others drink because they cannot survive the silence or the craziness that's going on in their mind. Now, that's different. That's extremely different. And yet, if we only attack behavior without addressing the pain beneath it all, what are we doing? We're simply cutting weeds while leaving the roots alive underground. They're just going to regrow. So let's be honest. Let me be honest. Let me be honest. The first use, it usually is a choice. That's the uncomfortable truth. Nobody accidentally injects heroin the first time. Nobody accidentally buys alcohol. Nobody accidentally starts hiding the pills. Choice exists. Curiosity exists. Peer pressure exists. Pain exists. Rebellion exists. But here's where people oversimplify addiction. They think because it started with choice, it remains fully controlled by choice. And that's not always true, because repeated behavior rewires the brain. That's neuroscience. That is neuroscience, ladies and gentlemen. Let me simplify this. Just like repeated gym workouts strengthen muscles, repeated substance use strengthens neurological pathways. Your brain learns, oh, this substance equals relief. That's what your brain is learning. And once the brain associates survival with relief, the fight changes. Now, you're not simply chasing pleasure anymore. You're trying to escape the depression, the trauma, the shame, the anxiety, the feeling of abandonment, the self-hatred, the emptiness. That's what you're trying to escape. That's why people continue using even when the consequences are so severe. Because emotionally, Their brain believes the pain of sobriety is greater than the pain of destruction. Come on, think about it. Think about it. Some people aren't trying to get high anymore. They're trying to not collapse emotionally. That's why judgment without understanding becomes dangerous. Because many addicts are not partying. They're drowning quietly. So let's jump into the brain disease model. Let's discuss this model, right? The medical field says addiction is a chronic brain disease. And there is truth there. There is truth there. Research shows what? What does research show, Mike? That dopamine changes the system, the dopamine system changes. The reward circuits become distorted, right? Impulse controls weaken. Stress responses intensify. See, the brain literally adapts around substances. So the brain literally adapts around substances, especially with opioids, meth, alcohol, benzos, right? The brain starts functioning differently. And honestly, that explanation helped reduce some stigmas moving forward, because for years, ladies and gentlemen, for years, addicts were simply labeled as weak, lazy, evil, failures. But the disease model helped many start to realize, hey, this is more complicated than we thought. And that this is important. That's very important. But here's the problem. Sometimes people hear disease and subconsciously translate it into, man, I'm powerless forever. And that becomes dangerous, because while addiction affects the brain, people still need ownership. Recovery requires participation. You cannot medicate somebody into purpose. You cannot prescribe identity. You cannot pill somebody into self-worth. That's why some people stay sober physically, but remain broken emotionally. Still angry. Still bitter. Still empty. Still traumatized. Still lost. See, they stopped using, but never healed internally. And eventually, that untreated internal war pulls many back into the same old, same old. Because abstinence alone is not transformation. I know people with years clean who are still mentally imprisoned. And I know people early in recovery who radiate freedom because their identity is changing. That external behavior matters, but internal transformation matters most. Now, listen, now, ladies and gentlemen, now we're getting to the real battlefield: trauma. Not everybody in addiction has trauma, but many do. Childhood neglect, violence, molestation, molestation, abandonment, fatherlessness, bullying, poverty, rejection, chaos. That's all trauma, ladies and gentlemen. And what happens to a child emotionally when pain is never processed? That child adapts. That child adapts. Some become angry. Some become withdrawn. Some become hyper independent. Some become people pleasers. And some discover substances. Why? Why? Because substances temporarily solve emotional problems. Alcohol for me, it temporarily solved my insecurities. It temporarily solved my social anxiety, my emotional pain. Opiates may temporarily solve emotional sufferings, internal emptiness, grief. Meth may temporarily solve low self-worth, energy deficiency, depression. I actually spoke with a participant and her story was amazing. Her story was amazing and not throwing too much out there, but someone introduced her to meth and it gave her the energy that she needed to handle her motherly duties. And before you know it, bam. See, the substance becomes emotional armor. But eventually that armor becomes a prison. And now the addict is no longer simply using to feel good. They're using to avoid feeling bad. That's emotional survival. And many people never learned emotional regulation. Nobody taught them. Nobody taught us how to process pain, how to communicate emotions, how to feel safely, how to trust, or even how to heal. So substance became the shortcut, the go-to. Temporary relief with permanent consequences. And this is where families sometimes struggle to understand addiction because they're asking, man, how can they keep hurting us like this? While the addict is internally asking themselves, man, how do I survive my life? See, that's the war that nobody sees. Here's another deep part to this whole entire conversation we're having. Identity. I personally believe most addiction recovery fails. We fail at the identity level. People are told stop using, but nobody's teaching who you are without the addiction. Yeah. Think about that. Think about that. People are told, hey, stop using, but nobody's teaching them who they are without the substance. If someone spent, please check this out. If someone spent 10 years high, 15 years drinking, 20 years surviving, then Addiction became what to them? Their coping mechanism, their identity, their social circle, their emotional regulator. So when substances leave, there's a terrifying question left behind. Who am I now? Who am I now without this? That silence destroys people. Because recovery is not just removing the substance. Recovery is rebuilding a human being. See, that means rebuilding their thinking, their self-worth, their discipline, emotional regulation, their relationships, purpose, their beliefs. And this is where many people relapse. Not because they want destruction, but because they don't know how to live as the new version of themselves yet. That transition is terrifying, especially when all your old environments still know you as the addict, the drunk, the screw up, the failure, the black sheep. But recovery requires identity reconstruction. And until someone believes I am worth healing, self-destruction will always remain nearby. That's why I say addiction is not the primary problem. Addiction is the symptom. The real battle is identity, trauma, the belief system, emotional survival. And until people heal there, the relapse risk remain extremely high. Now, listen carefully. Hear me out. Because this part matters deeply. Compassion does not mean removing responsibility. And responsibility does not mean removing compassion. We need both. We can acknowledge the trauma, the brain chemistry, the environmental pain, while still saying you have to participate in your recovery. Healing requires ownership, not shame, ownership. There's a huge difference. See, shame says, man, I'm worthless. Ownership says, I need help and I must change. That distinction changes recovery outcomes because shame keeps people hiding, but ownership creates movement. And we also need to stop pretending that accountability is hate. Sometimes accountability is love. Real love tells the truth. Real love says, yo, you're destroying yourself. You need help. You can't continue like this. But real love also says, I still believe you can do this. That combination matters. Trust without compassion crushes people, and compassion without trust enables people. We need both. We need both, ladies and gentlemen. So, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? What's the answer that we're looking for? The answer is not simply tougher punishment, more shame, or just try harder. But it's also not endless excuses, the victim mentality, or surrendering all responsibility. The answer is transformation. Real recovery requires accountability, requires healing, requires identity rebuilding, requires emotional honesty, requires community, requires purpose and spiritual renewal, folks. People must learn how to think differently, how to feel safely, how to regulate emotions, how to face pain, and how to rebuild that identity. Because if the internal war remains untouched, the symptoms eventually return. And that's why I'll say it one more time before we close up. Addiction is not the primary problem. Addiction is the symptom. The real battle is identity, trauma, belief systems, and emotional survival. To the person listening right now, you may have done some terrible things. You may have failed repeatedly. You may have hurt people that you truly love. But hear me out. Hear me carefully. Your addiction may explain behaviors, but it does not define your value. You are more than your relapse, more than your record, that overdose. You're more than the shame, and you're more than that worst mistake. And healing is possible. Not overnight, not magically, but absolutely possible. And if this episode spoke to you, please share it with someone that's silently fighting battles that nobody sees. Because sometimes one conversation can interrupt the funeral. So welcome to the show where chains break, minds wake, and purpose takes its rightful place. And remember, healing starts with today's decision. Another day, another blessing. Peace.